Well, welcome again to this edition of Morning Coffee. This is a segment that I normally do on Mondays on Morning Coffee called the Expert Series. And now we're doing it on Friday, so welcome to this portion of that, okay?
I'm looking forward to it.
Right.
Two great experts today.
Yes, and Karen Elzey, who's basically the Associate Director of Workcred, which is a credentialing oriented company. And Karen has really set this whole stage with Roy Swift on bringing people that are talking about credentialing and certification as an alternative to formal education.
So important.
Right, it's so important. So what we're doing today is we're going to have Karen on along with Michelle Van Noy, who's the Director of Education and Employment Research at Rutgers University here in New Jersey. So, hey, ladies, welcome to this edition of Morning Coffee.
Thank you for having us.
Good. Karen, why don't you just tell our viewers that maybe haven't seen Monday segments a little bit about Workcred first, and we'll get to Michelle.
Sure. So Workcred is an organization affiliated with the American National Standards Institute, and we really focus on strengthening workforce quality by looking at the credentialing system. And by credentialing system, we mean everything from badges to certifications, certificates, and degrees, and making sure that those types of credentials have relevance, labor market value, and credibility both to individuals and to employers. So we conduct a variety of research and projects around that issue of labor market quality and credibility.
Good. Great. And Michelle, one of the things that you and I talked about previously before our segment today was the rising urgency for making sure the quality standards for non-degreed education credentialing is so important. So would you like to address what you're doing at Rutgers in that regard?
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to. At our center, at the Education and Employment Research Center, we look at all things that are sort of related to that intersection between education and work, and credentialing is one of those really important issues that help bridge education and work. And, within that area, non-degree credentials are really such a large and growing area of activity, and one where there are not a lot of widely adopted and used standards for ensuring quality. And as interest in the public grows and having shorter term ways to get skills that are related to work, non-degree credentials really do fit an essential role. We've seen the data over the pandemic. There's an increasing interest in these kinds of credentials, and there's just been such a proliferation of them. And so we've done a fair amount of work trying to, along with many others who are, contributing a lot in this field, like Workcred and many other organizations, to begin to create dialogue and generate research on ways that we can promote quality. It's not something to just say we could pull quality standards or processes from traditional credit programs and just overlay them. Here we're talking about different kinds of programs with different goals, serving different learners, and certainly we can learn from that world, but we're also talking about a different set of programs. And so some of the work that we've done has been looking at conceptually trying to understand what are we even talking about when we talk about quality related to credentials. And so that's part of what we did in terms of developing a framework for thinking about quality.
Now, when we talked before, Rutgers actually has developed a four component system on working with quality. Would you like to go into that and explain it for us, please?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's the, it's a conceptual model for non-degree credential quality. And we realize, there's a lot of other ideas in this area too, thinking about quality. So it's really helpful to have this kind of dialogue and think about this. It helps us all move our conceptions forward. What we came up when we were thinking about non-degree credential quality is, in some ways, is really to kind of break down what we're talking about when we talk about quality. It's a big term, and like many terms in this field, it can mean many things to many people. And so I think what we were trying to do is just give us some conceptual clarity when we're talking about quality and what it means. So I think one of we have these different components of quality as we've tried to define it. One is the credential itself. How is the credential itself designed? So we're talking about, what's the content in it? How relevant is that to the goals of the credential? What are the instructional processes or assessment processes that are part of the credential itself? How stackable is it? How portable is it? Is it something that somebody can easily take from one labor market to another? Is it something that someone can use to advance, their education if they are interested in continuing? Is it clear? Is it transparent? Does the credential itself, is it known what it means in terms of the design of it? And then is it accessible and affordable? So there's a lot of things that just are baked into how the credential is designed. And you can have a very, we could go through each of these components and talk in more detail about how an organization would know a credential is quality. But now we're just talking about the actual credential itself. Now, there are outcomes from that credential that we care about a lot, and those are certainly related to having a high quality credential, or credential that's designed with high quality. But those outcomes, or the value that I might say attached to the credential, is a separate but related issue. And the value we would talk about are some of the outcomes that people really look to the credentials for. Are they getting better jobs? Are they earning more money? Are they able to continue on with education? Does it have an impact on employers and productivity? Does it contribute to the labor market? So there's all these sets of questions about how that labor market, how the labor market value of that credential is, how it plays out in terms of outcomes. One step before that, I should say, though, a really important outcome that's really hard to measure often, and is not articulated often well, is the competencies that the credential holder has. So we would expect a high quality credential to lead to credential holders who have the competencies that the credential holds. But that is a separate question that is related to outcomes from the credential, that has to do with the effectiveness of the credential in marking what it's supposed to mark. But that's a separate area. So that's one of the three areas we talk about. So we talk about high quality credential design, we talk about competencies of the credential holder, and then we talk about outcomes, whether it be for the individual, for employer, or for society at large. Now, there's another component here that often doesn't get discussed, and I know Workcred and others have been shedding light on this issue, but this is how the credential itself comes to take on value in a market, how it gets translated to value. So you might have a very high quality credential, and no employer knows about it, so they don't use it, so you don't see it reflected in earnings. Now, that could happen for a variety of reasons. This sort of translation of a quality credential to an outcome of value may not occur because people don't know about it, or there's other market failure issues in a market that don't reward the credential for the skills that it marks. We see certain fields are just low-paying fields, like certain, allied health care work, care work, and early childhood. There's a whole variety of fields that, and all of them operate differently. But I think the piece that we want to recognize here is that credentials come to have value often because of institutional and organizational and societal factors that are embedded in a marketplace. And there's a more complex set of issues that are transactional and have to do with how the value comes to occur. So those are the four components that we lay out in our model, and we hope that being able to break these down and think about them clearly can help us move forward with clearer policy and practice in terms of thinking about ways to intervene and to promote better systems of credential quality for non-degree credentials.
Great.
Michelle, what kind of trends are you seeing with credentials moving more towards outcomes? Because we've seen a lot of process outcomes, but we haven't seen, outcomes as much focused on wages. And where are you seeing that moving?
Well, it's interesting. I will say, I think that I guess we all know that within this field, the big challenge is getting data on outcomes, and particularly for non-degree credentials, the data are so limited. We're working with some states now to look at how they're measuring non-credit education at community colleges, which is within the community college sector where a lot of the non-degree credential activity occurs. And some states are collecting that data, but many aren't. And so it's very hard to look at those outcomes to say, at a state level, for example, do we know what the employment outcomes are for somebody in an industry certification program, for example. And I know that many organizations are making efforts in this area to build those better data systems, but I think the fact of the matter is that our current state right now is we don't have that data, so I think we ideally want it and need to move the whole data infrastructure to have that. But I will say, I do think that a lot of the discussions in this area really have been pushing that idea of focusing on outcomes. When we look at a lot of the non-degree credential quality discussions that are happening at the state level, I think many of them are very outcomes focused. And I think that's good because at the end of the day, that is what we care about. On the other hand, I do think that we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater in the sense of like keeping some process measures and some measures that focus on design are important. We can't just end up having this black box with only outcomes. I mean, if we are so lucky to get to that point where we have that, we still want to know what's the content and why is a credential valuable. It'll help with quality improvement throughout the process, and I think help credential providers be more reflective in what they're doing. So I would say both are important. There's a long way to go in terms of getting those outcomes though that we care about.
That's why I really like your framework, because it also focuses not just on the individual, but also on societal and social benefits. And I think that conversation that we think about outcomes in a very broad sense, that there are other benefits, maybe, how someone feels about themselves, greater civic involvement, intergenerational benefits, those things also need to be included. And sometimes I think you're right, we're so focused on getting the data that sometimes we also want to forget about the other aspects that are critically important both to society as a whole and to individuals.
Right. And I think that, the challenge with a lot of these is some of them are very hard to measure. It is very hard to measure, some of those broader societal outcomes. I have a research study for right now examining economic development, for example, not to take us aside, but, you start trying to measure a concept like that and how does education contribute to economic development, and it gets very complicated. There's a lot of factors going on. So, I guess, in putting out the model, it was sort of a wish list of all the things we should keep in mind, and then the recognition that some of them are very hard to measure, but it doesn't mean they're not important to recognize as important factors. And maybe we need to think creatively about how ways to measure them or different proxies to get at them. So
one of the things that I think is so important about credentialing and certification is it really emphasizes how a person's competency and skills are highlighted. And that I think that's what employers are looking for, especially with people that are changing positions because of the pandemic. Would you like to address that?
Absolutely. I think that's one of the reasons why there's so much interest in non-degree credentials is that they typically are very related to work and to occupations and to jobs. And the idea that a credential can lead you to a well-paying job is very appealing for many people. And so I do think that's really the key here, though, and that's why we do call out competencies as its own category, because it really is its own set of outcomes in terms of what makes a credential valuable. So, it is your closest outcome to a highly quality credential design is that the person comes out having the competencies that the credential says they should. And so, once you have that, you would expect that market processes would take hold and that credential would start to get translated into value as employers begin to recognize that the credential does mark people who are skilled and can do the work well. And so I think that it's a really the sort of idea that the non-degree credentials mark work relevant skills is really important on all sides. It's important for credential seekers who really are looking for jobs and looking for work-related skills, and it's so important in the labor market for employers to really take hold and value the credentials and use them in hiring. If they use a credential and they find that it doesn't help them find a worker with better skills than without using it, the credential's not going to take on that value. So it really is the essential component here.
Really critical. We have to wrap the segment.
Right, exactly.
What a great conversation, though. I think what I'm most impressed by is that now there are alternatives for people to find passion in the work they do in specifically targeted areas, not just a degreed area, but in an area of certification. So I think you're doing it's not just for employers. This is also for people who are looking for meaningful work, and I have to give you guys a lot of credit for what you're doing.
And I think that you're right. It's important for people who have degrees and those who don't have degrees. I think that non-degree credentials really can span the whole gamut in terms of people. They can help in occupations where there's relevance. And I think that's a really interesting point, though, that being able to have a more specific skill set can really lead people to finding work that is enjoyable, that is rewarding, and to be able to plug into those opportunities more directly than they might have been able to otherwise.
Really great.
Yeah, Michelle, we're coming to the point now where I'd like you to actually tell people how they can reach you and learn more about credentialing.
Oh, how they can reach me? Well, we have a lot of great information on our website. I can share with you a link. Perhaps you can post that or share that later. And of course, once you're on your website, you can find me and find my email and reach out to me. I'm always happy to answer questions, have these conversations, and share more of our work with others. We're always interested in really our work having an impact on the field and being able to share that with anybody who's interested in learning more about our work. Who our work can benefit. So definitely our website's a good place to start, and then connecting with me via email is always a good way.
Great, thank you both.
Yeah, thank you both, and Karen, thank you again for introducing me to Michelle and bringing her in this segment today. I appreciate it.
We'll have to get you both back, for sure.
Yes, no problem. It's always a pleasure. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you. And we'll
Thank
be
you
back
so much
with...
for having me. This was a great conversation. I appreciate it.
Oh, our
real
pleasure.
pleasure.
Have a great weekend, ladies.